Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the July meeting of the Chicago Map Society. My name is Curtis Wright, the president of CMS, and it will be my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's presenter, Jeff Cruz, in just a few moments. Prior to that, I have several quick announcements. To begin with, please forgive any slight impediment in my speech this evening. I'm not drunk. I just fell flat on my face earlier this week and busted up my lip and teeth pretty badly. So apologies for any mumbling and for having to look at this ugly mug tonight. We'll get Jeff on ASAP. With that unfortunate bit of news out of the way, I'm excited to announce that there is a possibility that this is our last Zoom-only meeting. While we have not yet received final confirmation, we do hope to return to the Newberry in September for a presentation on the Great Chicago Fire just 1 month before its 150th anniversary. But in case you're still wary about going out, however, we do hope to offer digitized versions of our in-person meetings when they do resume, depending on whether or not the technology is available in Ruggles Hall. Furthermore, we aim to continue our partnership with the other map societies from around the country, and together we will offer a diverse array of online programming until at least the end of the year. So keep an eye on your emails for further information there. In addition to our regular meetings, there are a few other special events that I want to mention. Later this month, Sammy Burke of New World Cartographic will be hosting an evening of antique maps at his gallery on South Halsted Street in Chicago. Doors open at 7 p.m. on July 29th with a lecture on the 500-year history of map making to begin at 8:15. More information and a registration link will be available in the chat box. Furthermore, we've been working with the kind folks over at the McLean Collection, and they have agreed to host us for a field trip next month. So mark your calendars for our normal meeting time, 5:30 p.m. On August 19th. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the McLean Collection is a magnificent private cartographic library less than an hour north of the city. It represents one of the finest private collections of maps and atlases on the planet. It really is truly spectacular. So if you're able to make this event, I highly recommend it. The presentation will be led by Dr. Michael Conson, who will be discussing the production of county atlases. We'll also have a registration link for this event. Vaccinations will be mandatory, and we'll have more information on that available via email coming out later this month. And now on to the main event. As a reminder, tonight's presentation will be recorded and made available on the CMS YouTube page. We'll have time for a question afterwards, so feel free to submit any questions as they pop into your head via the chat box. You can also raise your hand if you've got a question that you'd like to ask Jeff directly. As I mentioned earlier, tonight's speaker is Jeff Cruz. Jeff is an Evanston native who currently works as Director of Operations for the Edgar Miller legacy right here in Chicago. Jeff's work at the organization has made big waves. In 2019, they were awarded by the Terra Foundation for American Art and have also been featured by Smithsonian, Bloomberg, the Chicago Tribune, and other nationwide news outlets. Prior to his role there, Jeff studied at both NYU and Fudan University in Shanghai. In addition to the Edgar Miller legacy, Jeff also works with the Chicago Art Deco Society, where he serves as the executive vice president of the board of directors. Though you will soon see with his presentation that Jeff's passions and interests extend far beyond any one style, media, or trend. And with Jeff, with that, thank you again for joining us, and I'll pass it over to you to kick things off at your convenience.
Great. Thank you so much, Curtis. I'm super excited and honored to be joining all of you at Chicago Map Society this evening. Another fantastic and wonderful appreciation and educational organization here in the city. I'm glad to get to know you guys, and hopefully I can share some information with you a little bit this evening. The topic of this presentation, as Curtis had mentioned, is going to be on the evolution of Edgar Miller's graphic design work, and was actually a topic that was suggested to me by one of your members, Carlene Sifranietz. So I am super pleased to be able to share it with you tonight. What I'd like to do with this presentation is to kind of demonstrate the trajectory of graphic design work in general throughout the early 20th century, focusing on Chicago's creative art scene and Edgar Miller's career specifically. Edgar Miller was, until fairly recently, a little known creative professional and an all around Renaissance spirited artist who was extraordinarily prolific throughout most of the 20th century and most well known locally for his amazingly designed and handcrafted artist colony studios and homes that are known today as the handmade homes. We'll talk a little bit about those briefly. But Miller would mature professionally as an artist, just as the art of modern map design and modern graphic design actually would come to the fore in the Midwest, starting in the mid to late 19 teens through to the Second World War. And Miller's graphic design work, as we'll see, was emblematic of changes in media, messaging, design, and commercialization trends of the time. So today we will be briefly exploring Miller's early career and of course also take a look at some of his unique and gorgeous map design work, especially focusing on specific techniques and characteristics of his map making that really embody this transitional period and of art movements and design philosophies in Chicago at the time. Let's see, okay. So to get a sense of how Miller began his successful commercial design career, it's important to understand a little bit about where he came from. And we'll go ahead and start from really his formative years as a young artist. Edgar Miller was born right around the turn of the century in December of 1899 in the remote and rural town of Idaho Falls, Idaho. It was very much a Western frontier locale. The town had fewer than 1,000 people, really, inhabitants for most of Miller's childhood. And so he spent much of his time as a young student outside exploring his natural surroundings. It was a very picturesque upbringing, as you can imagine, right there on the other side of the Grand Teton Mountain Range. And Miller would go on to attend the School of the Art Institute in Chicago at a fairly young age. And back then, as it is today, the Art Institute, of course, was a very prestigious school for US artists. And Miller would hone his craft skills and practice ornamental design technique throughout his time at the Art Institute and through the early part of the 1920s in his own workshop and studio, as well as at major art centers like Jane Addams Hull House and firms like Iannelli Studios of Park Ridge. It is notable that Miller's first memory of encountering art was in fact a graphic print ad. At the age of 4, sometime around 1904, the local hotel and saloon in Idaho Falls put up this wall-size poster print of this Anheuser-Busch advertisement that depicts a very dramatic portrayal of Custer's last stand. Miller felt connected to the capability of art to tell a vibrant and transporting story within a single image, and would often impart immense amounts of detail in his own work that give it this kind of cinematic quality, as we'll see. And he quickly developed deft drawing and wood carving and drafting skills. Some of his very first paid official jobs was as an apprentice when he was a teenager, working for a local lithographer and also for an architectural firm, adding renderings and watercolors to the architect's portfolios. And he, of course, illustrated for his own yearbook and also learned home goods and artisanal craftworks from local merchants. So very much at a very young age, becoming what we consider a kind of a Renaissance man in his own right, And he also, we should note, kind of began to develop a vocabulary of motifs in his drawings specifically and in his wood carvings that really did, gain a lot of inspiration from the indigenous cultures, the Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest, which he really liked. Miller graduated from high school early to attend the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1917. We see here examples of work by some of the most famous visiting teachers at the time, and also some of these are traveling exhibitions, the early modern exhibitions that would have been there through the 19 teens and 1920s in Chicago. All of these would be later references for Miller's own ideas. And at the Art Institute, these artists like George Bellows and Richard Chase were part of a pedagogy that did very much believe that canvas painting and sculpture were the highest forms of art that could be taught. Miller really did kind of bristle against this theory. He rejected the differentiation between high arts and low arts and classical techniques versus modernism and modern methods. Miller's techniques were already fairly advanced, and his natural independence and iconoclasm was already making him feel restless in the kind of parochial setting of the Art Institute. He quickly became enamored with modern art movements and techniques, including Impressionism, Fauvism, Expressionism, Cubism, and early modern abstraction. Work by renowned artists such as Kandinsky and Picasso and Matisse that we see here were also becoming increasingly popular, even in the Midwest. So while still being kind of frowned upon by the Art Institute's establishment, Miller was very adept at kind of flying under the radar a little bit, mixing genres and techniques, really pushing the envelope in avant-garde ways to really experiment with some of these more modern techniques while still getting by at the Art Institute. And by the way, as you'll see throughout the presentation, Edgar Miller's own original work is usually outlined in red as I juxtapose it next to some other artists. The work that he was producing, as we said, was very modern, while also incorporating elements from his school lessons. And so he really had these pieces that imbue traditional and folk art elements and also the more classical elements that he was learning as well at the time. Miller never officially graduated from the Art Institute. Instead, he left on okay terms with the school, feeling that he was prepared to try his hand out in the art and design world independently. He quickly became a sought-after talent, first invited to work for the Iannelli studios at Park Ridge, which some of you may be familiar with, and which was quickly becoming a prolific design firm in its own right. Alfonso and Margaret Iannelli started their studio in 1919, where they specialized in decorative arts, sculpture, painting, and graphic design. Their success was in part thanks to their association with Frank Lloyd Wright's projects around the country. Their graphic design was already very modern, somewhat abstract and geometric, with its own kind of lexicon of motifs as well and patterns. Their work used pattern layering to produce this almost three-dimensional sculptural quality. Even in these posters, we get a sense of that. Miller quickly picked up many of Iannelli's design ideas and was very soon commissioned to develop ad campaigns through the firm, including work for Midwest companies like Martin & Martin Shoe Company and Bauer & Black talcum powder brand. His designs were already by the early 1920s very sleek looking, almost Art Deco in feel. Around the same time here in the early 1920s, Miller was kind of living on his own. He had rented a small coach house apartment, which he turned into his working studio and a gallery space. which he dubbed the house at the end of the street, and which was located at 19 West Pearson, just 4 blocks west of the Water Tower. It was in this neighborhood known as Tower Town that Miller cultivated a following among fellow artists and creative professionals in the area, and where he was most exposed to modern art as explored in the Midwest. At his gallery, Miller became known as a collector of some of the most avant-garde artwork in Chicago. American contemporaries of Miller's, such as Blanche Lazelle and Lionel Feininger and Albert Block, had their artwork on exhibition for sale to personal collectors at the house at the end of the street. And often these pieces were colored or sometimes monochromatic, 12-inch by 12-inch woodblock prints. That was a pretty common format for collectible artwork at the time. All of which were very modern, abstract designs, as we can see here, and were ideal for mass production. And we'll see that this medium and style was a natural starting point for both local commercial artists and also for mass print works and workshops for projects such as maps, as we'll soon see. I do want to briefly mention that it was also around this time, later on in the later 20s and through the mid 30s, that Miller began what was likely his greatest project, the creation of the artist colonies and the built artistic environments of the handmade homes, as they're known now. These studios are what Miller is best known for today, for sure, and were really his grandest undertaking. These were huge scale architectural rehabs of near North Side buildings, Victorian style homes, and also apartment buildings that he reproduced in his own image, and that, again, in terms of style, certainly coincided with what was very much on the avant-garde side of the era. And so it's interesting to kind of see how, his imaginative, decorative designs and architectural embellishments for these homes really did seep into his graphic design work, and vice versa as well. And so it just also really gives you a sense for how much work he was producing throughout his 20s and 30s. You'll see that, beyond just all this print work that we're focusing on, you just have to also imagine all of this fantastic architectural, sculptural, painting, all the commissioned work that he was doing as well. It was very, very prolific. And the studio's interiors, just to give you a sense and some color, still house some of the city's greatest embedded art and architectural designs. And we can see how the homes like the Glassner studio here on the right are really a culmination of Miller's design aesthetic to date for him around 1930. Some of these homes are actually sites where many of Edgar Miller's full oeuvre that has been collected, including the maps and a lot of his graphic design, are housed, and where artists and designers and researchers can learn from his work today. So to move on to talking a little bit more about graphic design work, the early part of Miller's print media career was very much dominated by the aesthetic and format of woodblock prints, as we'll see. The medium was second nature to him from his childhood. He could carve just about anything, whittle any piece of wood that you gave him. And so, as we mentioned, this was a perfect medium for a small studio and print shop artist. And during this period where Miller was very busy with other projects, the following examples that we'll see here very much showcase Miller at his most prolific and expeditious. And during the early 1920s, Miller would also hone a variety of media, not just woodblock printing, as we mentioned, but also monochromatic and polychromatic lithographic print design, and also batik and silkscreen textile print work. These techniques could all be done within the modest workshop, like the house at the end of the street where Miller did a lot of this work. And for an artist like Miller, who is keen to master as many techniques as possible, these particular media played well with each other and played a huge role in honing his aesthetic style. Each of these techniques share a gradational layering process whereby the designer has to meticulously create very detailed line work and customization over successive layers, which naturally forced an awareness of negative space, um, and produced subjects by highlighting kind of the missing color or the background color and shapes, often with the base layer of the piece ending up as the image's foregrounded subject matter, appearing as if it's on top, such as the case with the application of wax to base layers of fabric. As we can see here, the white here is actually the base layer of the piece here. And in many ways, the restrictions of the technical aspects of the printmaking in this way made Miller especially adept at thinking of his artwork in highly texturized layers and in colorful ways, as we'll see. And Miller was producing everything from letterheads to logos, stamps, flyers, booklet covers, printings for newspapers. Knowing that he was super skilled and speedy in his craft work, fellow creative professionals and local establishments such as the Dill Pickle Club would commission him to produce hundreds, if not thousands, of woodblock prints, in a given week or a couple weeks. Just a few examples here that Miller produced in the mid to late 1920s. Woodblock printing was a very popular medium at the time for a number of reasons, mostly due to the fact that you were able to make hundreds of quick copies without the need of any heavy machinery. And for the most part, Miller would design his most of his work extemporaneously, by hand, very quickly, adding these kind of extreme flourishes, and really mastering in the carved wood the art of creating silhouettes and shading in what certainly to a layperson seems like a very rigid medium. And it should be noted that these multiple layers that you had to navigate around in the printing process allowed for really interesting coloring techniques. Miller would often create what appears as this kind of off-register color blocking, where colors would intentionally not be printed perfectly congruently with border lines and with the line work of a piece. This became an aesthetic that Miller and other graphic designers would actively cultivate in prints and also emulate in other media, accentuating the period's modernist and expressionistic aesthetics by using this technique. This imprecision harkened back to a more cubist look and feel as opposed to the more clean and also medieval style of Japanese or European medieval woodblock prints, where patterns and perspectives were being used. Miller himself was really just incredibly masterful in incorporating these intentional negative spaces to produce highlights. We can see here, for instance, just using the background of the white to produce minute little highlights here. Again, a very tricky medium for a layperson to kind of really figure and understand, but we can see these extremely subtle uses of white here that give the basic forms of these pieces real unique freshness. And in the illustrations as well in this era for Miller, there was this quality, this simplicity, which understandable given that, when you're commissioned to do dozens of individual illustrations for a given project here, you wanted to find ways to make things a little bit easier for yourself. And his illustrations would very much, again, use this resonation, this off register to create this resonation of colors, this aesthetic of a really resonant and vibrant look for something as small as like a stamp. It was very eye-catching. There's also the stained glass quality to much of his work, in that he was very much aware of the light kind of coming from behind the image, or he's perceiving that, or having the viewer perceive that, much like one of his painted stained glass window panes. And that brings us to our first real map of Miller's. This is an invitation to the Carl Street Studios, one of his own handmade homes that I had mentioned earlier, in what is now the Old Town neighborhood of Chicago. And if you look at the map, you can see the major streets that it's by: Wells Street, LaSalle, Clark over here. So we're facing the top is west, and the Gold Coast and the eastern front is towards the bottom of the page here. What we see here is a 6x7, pretty much a postcard sized flyer. The original woodblock print for this would have included the typeset invitation, probably on the opposite side. So it would have been a two-sided postcard type of thing. And a closer look at the flyer here allows us to see really some of his more interesting design techniques that he incorporated here, and some of the symbolism that he liked to use. This double-decker, or sorry, this one here is this, the trolley. The trolley is here, with the kind of lightning bolt, the electric trolley along Wells Street. And also the double-decker bus here, the number 44 bus, that would have gone up and down LaSalle. You'll notice Miller's incorporation in a lot of these images is really subtle use of kind of incredible little details and line works, this skid marks on the road, and the lightning bolt again to really connote energy and movement, which is really cool. There's a real dynamic energy here. And Miller, again, using what you will slowly become very apparent, this very, his kind of very much his own unique motif work throughout as well, that he carried with him all the way back from his childhood as well. Likewise, some symbols that he would use very commonly. This is the X that marks the spot for the Carl Street Studios here. And just to kind of, juxtapose the map on the left with some of his other graphic design work, what we see in these two small postcard-sized flyers is that, his maps and a lot of his graphic design work, his print work, really had this tactile feel. You kind of want to touch these, you want to feel the textures, even though it's just ink on a page. He was intentionally creating, through different woodblock techniques and use of inked cloth, the shading for a lot of this as well. So it definitely has a really great tactility to it. This piece on the right is another invitation for the Dill Pickle Club in Tower Town, which utilized several different wood blocks to get this patterning. Has this great diagonal bias, these really, really intricate patterns here. It really makes you want to turn these pieces around in your hand. And around the same time as this period as well, Miller was being commissioned to illustrate some mass publishing projects, including illustrations for a number of children's, young adult, music, art, and genre books, mostly from local Chicago publishers. These illustrations would have used monochromatic lithography for the mass printing. And so Miller did the designs and templates for these. And one great example of Miller's work here is this short novel on Sweetwater Trail by Sabra Connor, which is published in 1928, and the story is about Kit Carson, a famous American frontiersman who had many expeditions out west. And so it was a perfect project for Miller to play around with and create a number of different maps. He also designed the jacket, the outside panels and inside end sheets here, as well as the chapter headers, as we can see these kind of medieval-esque drop cap letters here, which each have their own unique design. And each of these small maps at the beginning of each section, there's 5 sections in the book. And so really these commissions, this was one of his earlier ones, these commissions would really grow in scale. And as we can see, they were made very much for the evolving printing technologies. And we also see how Miller is also evolving from his more DIY method of the woodblock prints to a more refined method of printmaking. So these small maps were Miller's real first foray into pictorial map design, which was gaining steam in America, as we will also see. But just to get a closer look at these maps, this is the first of the 5 parts of the book here, and this is the southernmost tip and corner of Illinois, as we can see. And we see the incorporation of real intricate, precise details, all of which pertain to the story. And even with these kind of introductory illustration, Miller is really incorporating authentic story elements and improvised kind of touches. No mention of a steamboat in the story necessarily, but he added that, knowing that that would have been there. And he's using his own handwritten untidy typography here, which is nice to note. It fits in really perfectly with a kid's book. The lack of precision, which is also something that is very much a telltale sign of Miller's work. And he also included his own little embellishments, adding a personal signature and these little details of indigenous cultural motifs. Each of the compasses in each of the book, or in each of the maps in each part of the book, is different, and he stylizes them slightly differently. And we just see here, how Miller really heightens the experience for the reader with these kind of quick, rudimentary sketch and line work, but he's really able to provide a decent sense of details from the map. The map, even with this minimalist level of line work, really conveys terrain and geographic sites and weather, and the key here shows travel and activity and events in a very unobtrusive and nicely stylized way. So altogether, again, really interesting kind of transitional period for Miller in terms of his graphic design work. And here we have, while not technically a map, another monochromatic lithographic print design that Miller did for Marshall Fields. This is a depiction of the entire world. It's for a holiday ad that would have been in their magazine. And what's interesting really about this piece is his real incorporation of layers. And we see this striking, kind of two-tone, 2 different aspects within the piece, with one half subjects using the negative space to produce the line work, with the dark side almost entirely colored in black, with the white negative space creating the forms. Again, harkening back to Miller's ability to really use his woodblock print silhouetting techniques to a very high degree. And we also see just an incredible variety of textures and types of natural elements here, as well as a very, kind of modern style. It's a very eye-catching dynamic, a very Art Deco image. Again, hearkening to those woodblock prints that he would do. Miller was by this time a go-to designer for a number of local companies and brands, as we'll see. And he was beginning to really hone in on this modernist grammar and vocabulary in his colored work as well. And beginning with his references to expressionism, we talked briefly about Miller's strong appreciation for the early modernists like Picasso and Matisse of the period. And here we see how powerful the techniques from the Fauvists and late expressionists could be when translated into commercial work. Miller would incorporate these techniques for the backgrounds of many of his designs. There's more impressionistic textures here, for instance, that would reminiscent of works by early modern era artists such as Vasily Kandinsky, Jean and Roel Defy, and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Over the course of about these 20 years, what we see here in the kind of European modern art era is a detachment of color from the subjective work. And again, remember how he was doing that with the woodblock, the colored woodblock prints, the off-register technique there. Very similar in terms of what artists were doing in painting work, with brushstrokes really beginning to form in these color blocks with striking tones. And we see how he implemented this in another ad, this one for the Container Corporation of America. And so it's at this point that Miller's career, where he's really kind of incorporating and culminating this modern art aesthetic in his designs. And again, just a few examples here. Won't belabor the point, but these are just chock full of what were these kind of borrowed techniques from European artists. But we see now this transition directly into, by the early 1930s, this is very avant-garde aesthetic that had really blossomed from a style that referenced modern art into a kind of fully formed aesthetic here in the Midwest of its own. These are all Miller's print works for a number of different companies. And here just a few more really fantastic pieces. And what's another nice highlight again is his ability to really, kind of envision an entire piece, including the border work, including, typography and motif work. We'll see all of that being played out, especially in his pictorial maps in just a little bit. But the covers here are a great example of how colorful and bold and detailed the graphic design work was getting in this time. Oop, yeah, that one. Okay, so I'll just kind of go through this really quickly because I want to make sure that we look at the maps, but I do want to just highlight a lot of his detail work here and his ability to do printmaking techniques. And that does bring us kind of to examination. I just have a really quick cross-section of fellow early modernist designers, including New York-based creator Joseph Platt, whose work is here. Really, I just want to show how all these artists and designers were starting to really cross over genres. They weren't just doing the print ad work. They weren't just doing even things like stage design. They weren't siloing themselves. The 20s, again, as we know, with a fashion and Art Deco industry really booming, artists were starting to be asked to cross over genres and do work across a number of different things. And that included what was kind of at the time a new, completely new medium, which was pictorial maps. And we'll see how some of these graphic design techniques were borrowed from the commercial side and the advertising side, and used in the maps as exemplars for these artists. And so, as many of you know, I'm sure, as map enthusiasts, this modern era's pictorial map designs were made in large part thanks to the major developments in lithography and lithographic machinery in the mid-19 teens. It was also a shift to these kind of more comprehensive commercial projects where advertisements would verticalize a lot of their themes so that you would see the same ideas and brands and logos and copy in advertisements, in posters on the train, in the store, and on packaging. The verticalization of this, of a different print medium were becoming much more prevalent here. And here we just have some of these really great examples of the early pictorial maps. I'm sure you're all familiar with these really famous pieces, the Wonderground map of London and the Boston map here by Edwin Olson and Blake Clark. And to look at what I'm also sure that you're familiar with in the Chicago style here. Many of these famous artists, contemporaries of Miller's, working also in the Tower Town art scene. Terzak, for instance, again, showing now more the scope of and range of these artists' ability, showcasing their wit, their ability to make political commentary, for instance. In general, these maps were a way for artists to showcase their range of talents, their clear understanding of geometry, of architecture, and ability to apply different perspectives. So a lot of artists were keen to just practice with these. Here's a few more really great examples. Events that would have been commemorated with the use of pictorial maps, major commission works for things like the Century of Progress or University of Chicago. Lots of great details to be found throughout all of these as well. And to move on to Miller's own pictorial map projects here. Again, this period of the late 20s, early Great Depression period. Again, the other major events in Chicago, as we know, were the federal arts projects, commission projects for that were funded by government grants, and also the Chicago World's Fair. Artists were coming into town and showcasing their art in more diverse ways, and Miller was very much on the forefront of this and becoming, again, very widely commissioned for a number of different projects. And we have another map from this later 20s time period, which I think is really, really cool example of Miller's more larger scale map work. This is a map of a WGN daily radio show that was called Hiker and Buzzer's Trip Round the World. The radio show followed the journey of the first round the world trip of the Graf Zeppelin, itself a venture that was sponsored by William Randolph Hearst, owner of WGN Radio, and this map was done in partnership with Marshall Fields and Company as well. The nearly month-long trip of the Zeppelin kind of took a convoluted path. If I know as map enthusiasts, you'll probably either know very well how this went or want to know, but the Zeppelin's home port was in Friedrichshafen, Germany. And they went first to Lakehurst, New Jersey, which was the official starting point of this world tour. Then it flew back to Friedrichshafen and continued along on its 5-leg journey flying over many of the major European and Asian and North American cities along its trip route. And the trip took place from August 7th to September 4th in the summer of 29 there. And this gives us a sense for this radio program trip that kind of purportedly was meant to follow along, but I think it was a children's program by and large and was probably kind of fictionalized to go along with this. But it was a really great kind of marketing gimmick that Marshall Field kind of sponsored here. But, you know, this map does offer some really great individual details that we can kind of highlight. Miller used the, you know, this very, again, well-researched, oftentimes kind of going off script as we know, but he loved to incorporate lots of really details. It's hard to see in this version of the images, but, you know, lots of indigenous cultures around the world, Koreans, Japanese and Chinese, for instance, here. And he also just has this, you know, kind of, they're caricatures from our point of view today, but they're, you know, just the whole map is chock full of tons of these little towns throughout different regions, highlighting daily life in there and creating for kids especially kind of these fun stories and mnemonics for them to learn a little bit more about local culture. And of course, we see this kind of the borders here adding in this fun kind of collage-like sticker elements too. Another map that we have here is the map of the Brookfield Zoo that he did in 1934. The zoo opened in 1934, I should say. I think he probably did it a little bit earlier. The zoo was meant to be opened a little bit earlier than that, but there was some setbacks because of the Great Depression. It was a project that started in 1919, and here we get a chance to see some really great just interesting design work that, again, Miller, kind of only Miller would think of, I think, in some cases. The map itself was derived from one of the last architectural planning maps that they did by Edwin Clark's company, who designed much of the zoo, or the zoo's layout. And the Brookfield Zoo, as we know, it was kind of a really a newfangled project at the time that incorporated these natural enclosures. This was one of the first American zoos that did not use cages for animals and had watering holes and naturalistic components. And so Miller was able to really play with that and illustrate those as he saw them in the real world. So this is a really, really great place to see some of his special little illustrated designs here. And he also incorporates, this map was intended to be used functionally. They would have either given this out at kiosks around the city, at major department stores. It was intended to be used as advertising for the new zoo. And so it had this really great map to get there, really easy for city folks to drive out to Brookfield and show you where that is and how to get there by train or car or public transportation. And what I really do like about this piece are just kind of the little extra elements. The corner doodle here, as we can see, just something really random, no idea. It has no meaning, but is a really fun little addition that Edgar would put in so much of his artwork. And here we have a 1938 updated version of this map by Ralph Graham, who was an in-house designer for the zoo. And he, as we can see, really did kind of, derive his ideas from Miller's. They just updated it and kind of made it a little more functional. This version of the map, I think, would have been a smaller print, and they were able to start printing these to give out to visitors for free. So this brings us towards this kind of latter period of the early modern era, um, kind of the last era that Miller was really prolific in terms of his graphic design work. I won't go too much into this story just for time's sake, but this is a really fascinating partnership that Miller undertook as well. He did a number of projects for the Container Corporation of America, which was founded in 1926 by Walter Pepka, who is a really fascinating person in his own right. He founded an organization called the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado. But the CCA, the Container Corporation of America, there he really directed a lot of what we now know as mid-century modern graphic design elements. And Edgar Miller was a very much a forefront designer for them initially before they designed much more in-house. But he would initiate these really grand campaigns that would be promoted as art oftentimes. And he was going to the Art Institute, finding local talent, hiring local talent, and getting more fine artists to participate in graphic design, and allowing them to really stretch their own imagination. And he also hired Bauhaus designers like Herbert Bayer in the later 40s to participate as well. Many of us know about the Bayer Atlas that the CCA commissioned, and which is a very famous project as well. But before that project, Miller actually did the first atlas with CCA and Rand McNally in 1936 as a commemoration of the 10th anniversary's founding. And this would have probably just been handed out to major clients or high-level executives in the company. It was a very short-run publication, but this Atlas of the World is a really, really fantastic illustrated example that houses thousands of individual illustrated images. It incorporated what we see here as these kind of like abstract shapes and color blocks. We're kind of familiar with this almost woodblock-esque color technique that Miller really, really liked. But he created, these really dynamic whole image pages here. But as we get up closer, we see these kind of window-like views of these miniature vignettes that as you get closer, we see so much more detail and so much more intricate storytelling and line work going on. Each of the 48 states at the time had its own informational entry and highlighted key encyclopedic facts about it, the state bird, the state flower, and he used these kind of two-tone color palettes and used, again, this signature color blocking figuration technique here. And so we have entries for Alaska, which I don't think it wasn't a state yet, but it was incorporated here. I forget whether it was a state in 36, but anyway, 48 or 50 states. Illinois here on the right, these really great examples of, again, use of negative space to highlight line work and feature, and to give a very unique dynamic set. Just on a single page, there's graphic depictions and then also infographic use as well, and just switching over kind of extemporaneously between these to convey a ton of information in just a single page was Miller's forte. Florida, Maryland, there. I'll go back, just give it a little bit of time. You can just take a look over these. But again, each of the states had these. There's so much to see and explore on each of these pages, and it's a really great book. And this was just one of several books that he was commissioned to do for CCA. But as an atlas, I do think it obviously pertains to the map theme, but was probably just the most prolific in terms of variety and just differentiation of styles. So we'll finish up by briefly just touching on the legacy of modern graphic design in Chicago and what kind of came beyond this 1930s period here. It should be noted that commercial illustration work really took off during this time in Chicago, in particular during the Great Depression, when artists were sought after as independent contractors, and they got a chance to know fellow community members very well and work during these the public works projects, and so these networks of artists who did more commercial illustration work would create these ad hoc kind of conglomerates, including what was called the 27 Chicago Designers, of which Edgar Miller was one of their founding members, that would create just these portfolios, publishing their own work and advertising it to commercial institutions in the city and around the country in general. But these artists produced, for hundreds of local brands, and continue to push the boundaries of modern design language in Chicago. And one of the last pieces we'll look at is that buyer atlas here, as we see, and we really do see by the 1950s a transition that became a much more what we know as a more contemporary template for textbooks and for graphic design in general. This was one of the really great exemplars of that, as we know, stemming from this Bauhaus theory of design work. But we do see that for each of these states now, the infographics, very different from Miller's illustrated works less than 20 years earlier. This incorporated layers of pictures, of monochromatic pictures, and a lot more data-driven infographic work, whereby color really conveyed much more of this quantitative information as opposed to, the more storytelling aspect of Miller's work. So we see that huge transition take place over the course of about 20 years. And for Miller, he never stopped as well. He produced all the way through most of the 20th century. He passed away in 1994, in 93 actually, I'm sorry, but he worked pretty much every decade of the 20th century and continued to do lots of really great design work for a number of commission projects. A lot more embedded design, was commissioned to do murals, many murals in the Midwest in particular, some of which still exist, such as the Standard Club, the Pabst Brewery. There's a mural there at one of the halls there in Milwaukee. He spent time in Florida for almost a decade as well. That's where he did another of his little woodblock prints to show his friends how to get to his house when they came to Florida. Some of his other projects included wallpaper design for what was once a very successful Chicago wallpaper company, Bassett and Vollum. These designs very much in quintessential modernist style that Miller really pioneered. And everything that he did just incorporated this this hand touched feel, this craftsmanship quality. And he really had this kind of holistic approach for all of his graphic design work, as we have seen. And so from our perspective, it's sometimes considered kind of quaint, out of vogue, but he really did emphasize the craftsmanship of his work. And I think that his artwork, even in commercial and graphic design, was very transporting. Audiences today still feel that way. And so the lessons that he carried all the way from his childhood about art its ability to transport somebody, its ability to just grab you initially was very much something that he carried with him, and that I think still resonates with everybody today. So I know we're running out of time here, but that concludes the presentation, and I want to thank everybody for joining this evening. I'd be happy to take any questions at this time too.
Wonderful. Jeff, well, on behalf of all of our membership, thank you again for sharing that wonderful, beautiful presentation on Edgar Miller's vast repertoire of magnificent design work. If folks do have questions, I encourage you to either raise your hand. I'd be happy to allow you to talk through the Zoom functionality, or you're welcome to submit them through the chat box. Jeff, I had one question. I immediately noticed the Frank Fisher Studios as just this beautiful design that I had seen before in Chicago. What are some of the ways that we can enjoy Edgar Miller's work here in the city?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're only now really just ramping up to getting back to doing our tours. We do regular tours of a number of these sites. Mostly right now, we're only doing outdoor tours. We are finishing up our summer tour schedule, but if you go to our website, you can first of all look to see whether there's still tickets for some of our tours this July, which will be showing off some of these really great sites, the handmade homes, at edgarmiller.org/tours. But otherwise, I encourage everybody to also sign up for our newsletter. We only send out, a newsletter once a month, but that's where we announce all of our next upcoming tours. Hopefully very soon this fall, we'll probably have another run of our walking tours. And hopefully soon, as early as next year, we'll be able to get back in to see some of the interiors as well. Most of his spaces are privately owned. That's been a major factor, of course, for doing that. And as beautiful and expansive as they are, they're actually very small on the insides. We can't take huge tours around on a regular basis. You can also check out a virtual tour that we have of what is probably his most fantastic interior designed work on our website, the Glasner Studio Virtual Tour. If you go to edgarmiller.org, check that out. Many of the maps and also a lot of the graphic designs you'll see hanging on the walls. You can kind of do your own virtual exploration of the space and see a lot of his other work and the work that he did in so many other media.
That's fantastic. One other question, we had a lot of thank you and compliments in the chat. With a individual with such a diverse and array of talents and a breadth of design work, well, how do you, as the director of operations, what are the goals of the Edgar Miller legacy? What are your guys's what's on your to-do lists there?
Yeah, well, we're still kind of relatively new, all things considered, especially in relation to many other historical societies and organizations. But first and foremost, it's to share this story. I think that this presentation does a good job of showing just one trajectory of how Edgar Miller really touched on so many of the great, oftentimes overlooked, sometimes forgotten, modern design styles and movements that really made the city what it is. He touched on what we know now as, Art Deco, and mid-century modern styles, the arts and crafts styles that were very pervasive throughout the city and that have largely been kind of forgotten by preservationists, but they're still there. And so we're very much interested in using Edgar Miller as an engine to drive appreciation for that and also preservation efforts for a lot of that work. And so, Edgar Miller is kind of this Forrest Gump character in Chicago's modern history, and he just kind of crops up in so many different circles and did so many really great projects, and was very much on the cutting edge and was avant-garde in his thinking, and it really did drive the kind of the development of artistic design work in the city. And so bringing that to the fore, we also are very much interested in having people, creative professionals of all kinds, learners of all kinds, access the work. So we have an artist in residency program, for instance, which is really great. It's thriving, and it allows individual artists to come in and do projects within these spaces and draw inspiration from Edgar Miller's work. But in general, we're very much looking to just bring more attention to his work, setting up exhibitions. In fact, this fall we'll have a temporary exhibition in October of some of his work that we'll be hosting. Again, if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll definitely be able to learn much more about that. And in general, we're also doing historical society work. So much like the Map Society, we do regular lectures and bring in people to do talks just to explore much more of this history on a variety of different topics.
Fascinating. Well, with a few more years, I'm sure that he will be as ubiquitous as Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe. So
that's the goal. Yeah, that's the goal.
Well, unless there are questions, we are at that sort of 7 o'clock mark, so we will go ahead and let everybody go. Again, Jeff, on behalf of the Chicago Map Society, thank you again for sharing your incredible research and expertise. It was a real pleasure to host you. I encourage everyone to check out edgarmiller.org. While you're out and about in the city, be sure to keep an eye out for any of his amazing architectural works. And again, Jeff, thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, and hope to see you at a future program. And thanks so much.
Take care.
All right. Bye now.